Well, welcome again to another cheery subject, namely the Black Death in art, music, and literature. I've subtitled this presentation Memento Mori, which is Latin for memory of death. And I think it'll become pretty obvious why that is a suitable subtitle. So, with the arrival of the Black Death in 14th century Europe, no one was left untouched. Attempts to understand the devastation that played out on a daily basis were overshadowed by the reality that frightened people will put their own preservation first, and in many cases, as a result of their fear, will abandon the responsibilities that their positions require in order for society to function. Ripple upon ripple of despair bludgeoned the medieval spirit. Omnipresent death, which is memorialized in the phrase memento mori, replaced previously normal modes of thought. So we're talking about a complete psychological trauma and revision of daily life. A pervasive notion that all was lost, the world was coming to an end, became firmly rooted in the medieval mind. And so that would be the mindset that would guide the course of daily life, and of course would inevitably, because we after all are human, find expression in various art forms. And so that is the subject of today's module and presentation. We'll look at the effect of plague and the memory of death in the visual arts, which are particularly well represented. And we'll continue on to a discussion of the plague as a theme for and subject in music. And lastly, we'll look at a couple of very famous pieces of literature which appropriated the plague as their theme. And we'll focus on pieces of literature that were written during the time of the plague to make this case. So the Black Death was captured vividly in the visual arts, and this is true both during the time of the plague and also in more contemporary works which attempt to go back and recapture the mental state of people who were enduring the plague during the 14th century. But in either case, whether we're talking about old works that come from the time of the plague specifically, or modern works that attempt to recapture the mentality that existed during the plague, the bewilderment and the resignation of the people who were living at the time was poignantly captured by the artists. Medieval art is described today as being darker in style than that which came before it, rather understandably, I might think. And to make sense of the darkness, painters were particularly prolific in their attempts to try to capture the pain and express the devastation in a visual form. And so if you do a quick Google search of plague art, you'll find hundreds of paintings and drawings that attempt to come to grips with what the plague meant to medieval society. So here's one that is particularly common if you Google plague art. It is a scene that takes place in Florence, Italy. And it's an attempt to capture what daily life was like during the time of the plague, which is clearly not a pleasant scene. So if we do an analysis, here we have a gentleman who's attempting to guide this lady away from the carnage that she's clearly looking at on the streets. This man here in the foreground is hiding his face in his cloak, ostensibly as a means of trying to get away from the sickening odor of death, which, given the number of bodies scattered around, would have been rather pervasive and inescapable. In the foreground here you see the reason why this is an event that was so consequential, so meaningful to medieval people, and that is that you see an entire family dead on the street. Here's the father, the woman partially clothed, and a child dead at her side. And this is the kind of devastation that really reroutes your psychological well-being. This is the sort of thing that causes people to go pretty crazy. And then back here, you see what happened when the bodies began to stack up. The death rate, the mortality rate was so high, people were dying so quickly, that there was simply no time to get rid of the bodies in a proper way. And so they accumulated on the street, and of course this is massively non-hygienic, and so there were sort of vain attempts to deal with it, but what are you going to do? You can't bury them, so they had to be stacked somewhere outside of town, and that was the best they could do at the time. So part of the reason that this was so devastating is that in medieval times, it was unthinkable that you would die unattended by a priest. And during the time of the Black Death, that became increasingly uncommon to actually have somebody there who could administer last rites at the time of death. And this, too, would have been psychologically tormenting for the people who were enduring all of this. So this is another piece from just after the time of the plague. It dates back to 1480 and was produced as a mural by Albertus Pictor. And it basically asks the question, does death have a sense of humor? You've heard of gallows humor that erupts during really challenging times, mostly as a foil for the depression that you might otherwise feel. So this is an example of that phenomenon. Maybe humor has the capacity to normalize society when it's buffeted by forces that themselves cannot be controlled or even adequately understood. So here we see a nobleman playing chess with death. And it leads to the question, well, if the nobleman wins, does he get to live? And this sort of thing is one of the things that humans do when they feel particularly pressed, when they can't make sense of what's going on around them. Because if you can convince yourself that you have at least a modicum of control over the forces playing out before you, it might mean the difference between survival and lethal despair. And of course, this is not an uncommon theme, and with respect to the plague, this theme was appropriated by Ingmar Bergman in his movie, The Seventh Seal, in which a human person plays a chess game with death during the time of the plague. So it was an impressive enough idea that it replayed throughout the history of art. Here we see another very common theme in plague art. This one dates back to the 16th century, so it's after the time of the plague, but there was a second plague, a second wave of death in Europe during the 16th century, so it's still legitimate plague art. And one doesn't know why she's not properly dressed, but we'll just let that go for the moment. As the European zest for life was replaced during the time of the plague, there became ensconced in the human brain the idea that the only future that existed was death. Memento mori, memory of death. And this painting shows death in the form of a skeleton appearing over the shoulder of this young woman who was preoccupied with the things that young women are preoccupied with, sort of vanity, looking pretty, having nice clothes, that sort of thing. And that would be a fairly common, congenial thing to be thinking about, not only in the time of the plague, but in modern times. That's, women spend a lot of time in front of mirrors preening themselves. And that was true during the time of the Black Death as well, but there's that dark shadow, that skeleton looking over her shoulder to remind her that during the plague, everything was death. Now this is an iconic, very well-known piece of plague art. It is dated back to the 16th century, but again, there was a plague during the 16th century, so it stands as yet another legitimate representation of plague coursing across Europe. It may be a depiction in the artist's mind of the end of the world. I'll show you several views of this. This is the biggest one that we can fit all in one slide. It's actually quite a large piece. It's called, appropriately, The Triumph of Death. So you'll note that the sky in the background is black, perhaps due to the smoke that was generated due to the burning of bodies. Upon the waters, you'll see ships that are wrecked. Could it be that they have run aground because their inhabitants have died at the oars of plague? Could it be a artistic representation of how plague appeared in Mediterranean port cities and then communicated the plague inward and northern in its direction? We see skeletons everywhere. Everywhere skeletons, animated skeletons are appearing among the living. The skeletons even attack those that are yet alive. We see a boat full of skeletons floating by, while a few of the living are either trying to tend the dead or perhaps loot them of valuables, because, humans don't like to let a good opportunity go to waste. There's even a skeleton on horseback with a scythe, which may be a representation of the horsemen of the apocalypse there to dispatch a few more souls to the great beyond. But even the horse that the skeleton is riding can't muster much in the way of flesh. In the foreground, a dog eats the flesh of a child who's dead. And those few humans who are still ambulatory try to escape through a tunnel, which I'll have a better picture of in a minute. But the message of all this is pretty clear, that whatever activity these folks are engaged in, it will do them no good, because this is the end of the world. So here you have oops, sorry about that. Let's try that one more time. Okay, that's what we started with. Here we see the darkness of the scene writ large. You can see the very dark background, again, filled with smoke. The source of fire here is probably some sort of crematorium to deal with all the dead bodies that are being stacked up around us. In the foreground, we see a lot of dead people. Here's the dog eating the young child. Here we see a table set. There's food still present, but everybody around it is dying. Here we see the horse with the rider pulling a wagon of skeleton, dead people. Here we see a nobleman in the process of dying because death claims us all. It spares not the rich. In that sense, it's the great equalizer. A very depressing picture, but nonetheless probably realistic and evocative of the things that people were feeling at the time. Here again is the horseman of the apocalypse on this horse, but as you can see, the horse is looking like he's ready to go underground himself. All of the skeleton appearing because death sweeps across the landscape. Again, the nobleman dying just like everybody else, although he's got a better set of clothes on, as he does. This is not the same picture. It's another piece of plague art, but again, it shows the utter devastation that these people were feeling, starting with the human. He doesn't look like he's quite dead yet, but he's loaded. His body is just riddled with buboes from his head down to his toes. Literally, if he's not dead, he soon will be. And this is a really ugly disease that is very uncomfortable. The welts, the buboes are very, very painful. And of course, he's dying in the street. There's nobody to bury him, so he's just going to be devoured by these dogs. We don't have any information on whether the dogs themselves would be taken by the plague. I presume not, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be bitten by fleas. And if the pathogen gets into their blood and rats are killed by it, there's no reason why dogs wouldn't be either, but I guess people weren't particularly interested in that question back in medieval times. This is another iconic piece of plague art. The man in this picture is riddled with buboes. You can see how swollen they are. This one, for instance, is nasty and black looking, so it's got a lot of blood in it. That's what's causing the black color. But you also get a sense of the agony that these things cause. So recall that buboes are common in areas like the neck, cervical buboes, in the groin area, particularly around the genitals, where that's a fairly tender area. And the swelling makes them very, very painful. And so what you see in this picture is this poor man has arched his neck, probably in response to the pain. Neck buboes are incredibly painful, and so you kind of twist the head around to get a comfortable position, and nothing much happens. It's still pretty painful. It may also be a representation of sort of end-stage plague, particularly if this is the pneumonic form or the septicemic form. Sometimes those forms invade the nervous system, and so people that have it are known to writhe in uncontrollable ways. They gesticulate in bizarre ways. And that's just because the plague is in the nervous system and it's causing them to behave in those ways. But the problem is that the pain can't be escaped, both because it exists in a physical sense, but also, and more profoundly, in a spiritual one. So you see this poor guy clutching with his hand in the foreground, this piece of cloth, probably trying to escape the pain by squeezing it, or perhaps it's simply the realization that he's going to die and will do it without any sort of medical assistance or spiritual assistance from a friendly priest who might administer last rites. The priest is probably himself dead or just too busy with parishioners dying to attend each and every person. Now, even in times of great emotional travail, humans gravitate to music and to dance as forms of creative expression. And during the time of the plague, the danse macabre is one of the lasting contributions of the Black Death to the arts. Scholars suggest that the danse macabre was probably first performed as a dance and then rendered into poetic form, and finally it became the subject of visual arts and was captured in paintings, one of which is featured here. The essence of the art form, whatever it is, whether it's dance or music or poetry, is to show living humans dancing with skeletons, and the message from it is fairly clear. Namely, you may dance today with the living, but your future is to dance with skeletons, because you will become one. Memento mori. The feeling of despair in the paintings is augmented by having the dancing skeleta often appear in grotesque and misshapen forms. And just to leaven the impact a little bit, a very common theme is to show noblemen who are well-dressed, and that's how you tell them apart. It shows noblemen as well as peasants appearing as dancers, indicating that death, at least, is sort of an equal opportunity avenger. It's a form of poetic justice, that the wealthy as well as the poor are susceptible to the ravages of the plague. But nonetheless, the impact of being danced off to hell, no matter how well dressed one is, still is horrifying. And to increase that horror, the skeleta are sometimes represented as pulling on or tugging at the living to advance their progression towards damnation, which is what you see here. The priest is being pulled on by the Skeleta, as is this nobleman. Come with me, I'll show you a good time. This is sort of a modern rendering of a Danse Macabre, sort of something that Tim Burton might have thought up, if you're acquainted with him. And so we have the lady with no clothes, but she got your stiletto heels on, and some pretty wild and crazy hair, as does the skeleton. This is a painting of the Danse Macabre, the Skeleta playing some nice music, some of them still sporting clothes from the time that they were living, and it's used to illustrate a musical piece composed by Camille Saint-Saëns. And another theme you've heard, if you listen to classical music, various composers have written invitation to the dance. Well, this is an invitation to the Danse Macabre, probably an invitation you'd be wise to decline. We also have some pretty good representations of the plague in song and music, because after all, humans like to capture all human emotion in music. Even in the absence of words to convey meaning, music has that mysterious power to bypass the parts of our brain that require cognition and go straight to the emotional centers to exert their influence. As a result, every mood can be captured in music, and we have every reason to suspect that the emotions that were generated and running at a fevered pitch during the time of the plague would have been rendered into music. This assertion is not hypothetical, but has been the source of some scholarly research in modern times. For instance, Dr. Christopher Macklin, who is, he may be promoted by now, but at the time he was an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Illinois, which is where I got all my degrees. Yay! Go Illini! And he did quite a bit of research on plague music and explicitly studied the relationship between the scourge of the Black Death and music. So among his findings, Macklin suggests that it's highly likely that a particular piece of music entitled O Sancte Sebastiani by Guillaume Dufay was a piece of music specifically written in tribute to the bubonic plague and the people who were suffering through it. As you will find out in the next module and in chapter 16 of the book, Saint Sebastian achieved sainthood because he survived an attack of multiple arrow wounds. And the reason he was attacked has to do with the Pope and other political stuff, so it's not particularly germane to this discussion. But it is germane to note that the arrow was a symbol of the plague. So because St. Sebastian was pelted by a whole bunch of arrows at once and he survived all of the wounds, he became a natural vehicle for sainthood and somebody you would pray to be relieved from or prevented from getting the plague as a result of his surviving this assault with arrows. So Macklin, in addition to analyzing O Sancte Sebastiani, he also explored ways in which music helps to conceptualize lethal illness. And he's done this both in ancient and modern times. He's looked both at the bubonic plague and in modern times at AIDS. In addition, because the performance of music is an ephemeral expression of art, that is to say, particularly in ancient times where there are no recording devices, no means to record a particular performance, Macklin makes the case that the emotional force of the Black Death can be gleaned by a study of a 15th century poem, which was probably rendered into music at various times, entitled Stella Celi Extirpavit. And if you're a Catholic person, you probably pronounce the Latin slightly differently, but I was trained in classical Latin, so that is my pronunciation. But you have the title there, so it shouldn't be confusing. The translation in English is Star of Heaven. So as the plague was cycling through Europe during the 15th century, its in the 16th century, and then one time after that, its impact would not have been mysterious during these times. And we can go back to these pieces of poetry and music that appear later than the 14th century to glean what was going on emotionally in the minds of the people who were present during the sweep of the plague across the Landstedt during this time. And if you read the lyrics to Star of Heaven, it's pretty clear what they were thinking. Star of Heaven, who nourished the Lord and rooted up the plague of death, which our first parents planted. May that star now deign to hold them in check, these constellations whose strife grants the people the ulcers of a terrible death. O star of the sea, save us from the plague. Hear us, for your Son who honors you denies you nothing. Jesus, save us. For whom the Virgin Mary prays to you. So this is an appeal to the deity to relieve us, to save us from the scourge of the plague. Now, in the book there's some additional music and the lyrics therefrom that will teach you about the role of music during the time of the death, and I will leave you to read about them. But we should also note that we dragged children into the discussion of what was going on during the time of the plague. And we have a bit of a conundrum. We're not entirely sure whether this is true, but the evidence supports the notion that it was apocryphal. The piece of music in question is that classic nursery rhyme known as Ring Around the Rosie, the lyrics for which you probably know, but if not, they are: ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. So the argument has been made that here in the lyrics, the ring in question was a reference to the dance. Some say the dance macabre, but those who like this idea that children were brought into the discussion of the plague prefer the notion that ring around the rosy refers to the ring of children as they dance to ring around the rosy. The second line, pocket full of posy, some authors say, is an allusion to the gathering of plant material and carrying it around in one's pocket. You'll find out in the next presentation that people during this time were pretty good herbalists. They knew a lot of plants. They knew a lot of chemicals in plants that could prevent or treat disease. And so during the time of the plague, people no doubt gathered herbs as a protective mechanism to prevent them from getting the plague. And so that's why this line, pocket full of posy, in other words, pocket full of something to prevent the plague, came into popularity as a piece of plague art. The third line, ashes, ashes. This has various translations and ideas about how it relates to the plague. One is the word ashes is the sound that people make when they seize and potentially spread the bloody sputum before they expire from the plague. And of course, they would, in the course of doing this, perpetuate the pneumonic form of the disease, or it could simply be a reference to what happens to the body after death when the bodies were burned, as you saw in the earlier piece of plague art, where there was a crematorium going pretty much full time during the time of the plague. And lastly, we all fall down is what happens when one expires from the plague. So this, again, from time to time, is popularly called a piece of plague nursery rhyme because of the ideas I just conveyed. But it turns out this rhyme was not written until the 19th century, as far as we can tell. So it was not something that the children during the time of the Black Death would have sung or used to ward off getting sick. But it may have been used for these purposes by children in later centuries when the plague was still active in Europe. Today, however, it's simply an innocuous rhyme that we learn in childhood and may dance to. This is the Dance Macabre version of Ring Around the Rosy. So you can see that the skeleta are decked out in posies, and look rather dapper, even though the message is still pretty dire. And there we have, if you don't already know it, the rhyme that is referenced in this nursery rhyme and the dance that goes with it. All right, let's move on to a discussion of literature in the time of the plague. And both of the two pieces of literature I'm going to discuss were written during that time. The first of which is the novel called The Decameron, written by Giovanni Boccaccio in the years 1350 to 1351. The book is an allegory that, among other things, documents the nature of life during the time of the plague in the 14th century. Now, structurally, the book consists of a series of novellas that chronicle the escape of 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, who were attempting to flee the plague in Florence, Italy, by retreating to a villa in the countryside. So they were obviously pretty well-heeled people, since they had the option of leaving town and going to a very nice villa. And while they're there, they're a little bit bored, and they didn't have Xbox to play with, so they start telling each other stories every night just to pass the time. Each person tells one story each night, and over a period of 2 weeks at the villa, 100 stories are collected to frame the narrative. The stories collectively deal with love, the tricks people play on one another, virtue, the power of human will, and the immortality and greed of the clergy. A theme running through the Decameron is that of Lady Luck, and the idea that one's fortunes can rise or fall precipitously as the wheel of fortune turns. Another element in the book is that Boccaccio uses allegory to tie specific themes in Christianity to events that take place in the book. Boccaccio is no friend of the church, and Boccaccio's purpose is not to educate the reader, but to satirize the church, as would be understandable during the time of the plague, and the inability of the clergy to stop it was an occasion to think of the clergy with contempt. And when that was combined with the excesses of the clergy and the frequency with which the clergy did nefarious things like rob their patrons of money, it made the clergy an irresistible target for Boccaccio in his book. Another piece of writing that's consequential during the time of the Black Death was the Canterbury Tales, produced by Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer was born in London in the early 1340s. He was a young child during the time of the Black Death, and sadly he only lived until 1400. But during his short life, he became a very influential poet, and his work continues to be widely read today, even in the wretched Middle English in which it was written. Certainly one of the most read works by Chaucer is the Canterbury Tales, which is a series of 24 stories that comprises roughly 17,000 lines. It's a long piece of work. Again, written in that Middle English, so it's kind of difficult for the modern tongue to pronounce, and also the modern brain to process. But the part that's relative to the plague is fairly short. It concerns 2 main characters who were the pardoner. The pardoner was the person who expiated sin through the selling of indulgences. So again, Chaucer was no major friend of the church either. And the second character was the so-called summoner, who rounded up and brought people forward to account for their sins. Both of these men, the summoner and the pardoner, were deeply corrupt, having liberally committed the very sins for which they were holding others to account. Death is the pervasive theme in the Canterbury Tales, as is the notion that we atone for sin through death. The plague appears in different places in the Canterbury Tales as the agent of death, notably in the general prologue and also in the pardoner's tale of the Canterbury series. As was the case with the Decameron, plague is mixed with an omnipresent fear of death and the extortion of that fear by unscrupulous people, many of them members of the clergy, to achieve their desired end. So, all told, it's perhaps comforting to learn that even in times of great devastation, the creative muse continues to sing. In the time of the Black Death, the voice of the muse was one element of humanity that could be relied upon. Neither medicine nor God was sufficient to curb the plague, but the human spirit continued to live in art and literature, which was created during that period, and the capacity for creativity, even under the most dire circumstances, should give us hope, I think, for the future. And here is your study guide.